Hello and welcome to today's Info Security Magazine webinar. My name's Dan Raywood, I'm the Deputy Editor of Info Security Magazine, and I'll be moderating today's event in association with Snyk, where we're looking at establishing a successful DevSecOps program, lessons learned from doing this properly, I guess. The speakers we're going to be featuring today about what DevSecOps is, how you can do it, of course, and of course, how different it is from the general DevOps concept. Where does security fit in? In the conversations we've been having with Snyk and with our other guest speaker, Nick from Pearson, we've been talking about all sorts of ways that this affects wider security models. So how do you make it successful? How do you make it work at all? That's what we're going to be covering in today's webinar. So before I introduce you to these other speakers, let's just run through a few housekeeping points. If you have questions, do please use the option to ask this. This is going to be quite an open forum today, and so real opportunity to get involved in asking really the speakers anything about what they've talked about in terms of DevOps and DevSecOps as well. I should get used to saying DevSecOps. And so please do use that option. If you're on Twitter, hashtag InfoSecWebinar, and we're on @InfoSecurityMag, as you can see on the bottom of your screen there. Now, of course, the main thing, of course, hopefully some of you are here for, is CPE credits. You can get CPE credits if you're a member of ISC Squared, ISARC, or EC Council. You get 1 CPE credit if you join us for a minimum of 50 minutes. So we're aiming to be here for about the full hour. So if you stick us for the full hour, you have got your credit. Once you've done that time, you can download your certificate from your Info Security account and submit it to your membership body. There's further instructions in the download section if you need a bit more information on how that all works. Sometimes they're processed within 48 hours. So if you're listening to us live here on Thursday the 12th, then big welcome to you. Maybe give it till maybe Monday or Tuesday next week before it's turned around. If you're listening to us many years into the future when DevSecOps is absolutely normal and everyone's doing DevSecOps, and you go back going, wow, in 2020 they really didn't know what they were talking about, or especially that moderator anyway, then well, thanks very much for listening to us. It's great to be having a great audience on our webinars as always. Now, speaking of great audiences, if this is your first webinar with us, you're going to be prompted to enter your CPE number when you registered with us. If you did not, but would like to collect a credit for attending this webinar and for future webinars, then very quickly kind of jump back out, sign out, go back into your account, add your CPE number as quickly as you can, and come back to us in the next sort of 3 or 4 minutes, because we'll aim to run to the hour, and we've been live for about 2 or 3 minutes already. So, you want to make sure you catch that, because unfortunately we cannot create them retrospectively because of they need to, the certificate will show how long you're on the webinar for, and that's part of your CPE accreditation. So that's all the housekeeping over. Let's introduce our speakers today. So I'm Dan from Info Security, and I'd like to be joined by Nick Vinson, who is DevSecOps lead at Pearson, and Patrick Debois, who's Director of DevOps Relations at Snyk. So
hey, Dan, you're still there?
Looks like Dan might be having some network issues.
Maybe I'll take over. So thanks for having us, Dan, and doing the introductions. The credits brought me back like many years ago when I was like saving on those numbers as well to get better at the industry. So I guess today we're here for listening to the amazing story that I've heard already, part of it that has happened at Pearson. So Nick, maybe you can introduce a little bit of yourself before we get started. So
hi everyone. I'm the DevSecOps lead at Pearson. I joined Pearson about 2.5 years ago now. They were looking to create a security engineering function. Pearson had already been undergoing a DevOps transformation and an agile project management transformation. And they knew they needed to do security engineering and bring that into the DevOps fold, but they didn't really know how. And so that's what I was brought in to do. Going to talk to you all about what we did to achieve that today.
Okay, thanks, Nick. I'll try to switch us to that you can see our faces. Let's see if I can do that while Dan is away. Hang on. There we are. Hey, Dan, you're back as well. So
Yeah, it was a DevOps on my internet connection that went wrong. Yeah, sorry about that, everybody. So I quickly whizzed back, and just proves how good homeworking is. Yeah, so I was just about to literally hand over to you too. So I hope I got your names right. Nick, I think we're going to kick off with you first, and I think have you just gone through the slides? But that's when I was offline.
Just
I
did
also,
an intro.
yeah.
Great.
And-
Well, let's move on to, first of all, let's just get a bit of an introduction from you both first, and just talk about a bit more about what you do. So, Nick, let's come to you first and talk to us about your role. So, I'm just going to get an idea again. You're fortunate because I've lost all my slides now, but
Don't worry
just talk
about it, Dan. Dan, he already did his introduction, so you missed that one. So,
So now I've listened to the recording, which by the way, everyone asking, do we get a recording? There will be available a recording after we've done this. This will be all available again. I'll be able to go back going, you fool. You missed such
this
a
is
good bit.
live. This is live. Don't worry about it.
It's
So
remote
a
working.
little bit of background from me. I've been at the very start of DevOps about 10 years ago, starting the first DevOps days. And I do have also like experience in the security field. And now recently this year, I joined Snyk, because the DevSecOps is something that is emerging from the field, where I think security is catching on in the field. What like excites me about this story is that you hear a lot like, is DevOps and DevSecOps like different? There's the same. And there aren't that many stories about people that are already sharing like almost like vetted practices or like practices with good results. So that's why I'm so excited to have like Nick here and present on his stories. So Nick, you kind of explained that, you were on that journey and they asked you to kind of as a lead to step in. Maybe to kick it off, because all the transformations, they usually start with some kind of goal in mind or some kind of problem that was hitting the company, when they asked you to step in. So maybe you can like tell us a little bit more on like the situation at like ground zero when you came in and how you kind of observed that.
Yeah, so like most places going through a DevOps transformation, they were trying to deal with two fundamental problems, which was time to market of the products and improving the quality. So they were going through those things, trying to put those engineering practices in place to ensure that. They also recognized that security was going to be a key differentiating factor and incredibly important to their products. So they wanted to build, design in security, make sure security considerations were treated the same as functional acceptance criteria for each new feature and for each new product. They wanted to ensure that security processes were built into their software development lifecycle.
Yeah, and I guess you're already lucky that they already understood the need, right? There was a business case, they hired you. In many cases, this is still something that people struggle with, like how do you kind of make the business case? So it seems like, market is a good pressure to have, right? And then agility is a good pressure to have as well to kind of respond to that. But I just wonder, because in many cases, DevSecOps comes up as when there's already a DevOps practice in place. Was that the case with you as well?
Yes. I mean, we were fortunate in terms of we had top-down buy-in for the importance of security. And I think that's becoming less of an issue these days as you're getting the value of data is becoming more and more. You're seeing more and more ransomware attacks, fines for things like GDPR. So that executive buy-in is mostly there now. That used to be a key problem. It didn't matter how good your security team and if they're identifying security requirements, if you couldn't get those security stories into your sprints, you were restricted in how effective you could be. But yeah, we were lucky in terms of we had that buy-in, and then we just needed to actually define and implement those engineering practices.
Cool. Well, we'll get back to the business case later, like how do you fend everything while you're going. But maybe you come into this company, you get hired. What's the first thing you do, right? Like, what did you do? Like, how do you get bootstrapped as a team?
So the first thing we did was came in as the security lead for one of the big digital transformation products called Global Learning Platform at the time, now called the Pearson Learning Platform. And they knew they wanted to do security engineering, but didn't know where to start. So the first thing we did was come in and identify what the security requirements were. So effectively, start threat modeling the product, which comprised of a containerized platform as a service, PaaS, and a whole load of containerized microservices which were deployed into that PaaS. So we went about threat modeling that hosting platform, those applications, and identifying what the security threats were, what the weaknesses which allowed those threats to be exploited were, and then identified compensating controls to implement to mitigate those threats. We then turned that into a body of work, which was as Jira stories on those project backlogs. So that's the first thing we did.
Cool. And you mentioned the word "we," so you were not alone. Like, how do you go about creating the first team and kind of like find allies in the company to kind of get like the team going? How do you go about that?
I mean, in terms of allies in the company, it's finding like-minded people who are passionate about what we're doing in terms of DevOps. And from a security side of things, that's who we were bringing in, because that function didn't really exist from a security engineering perspective. So I went about hiring people to come into our team to help deliver that. And in order to deliver those security controls and put those processes in place, we needed people who understood the security risks and also had experience building and managing those services, so they actually knew how to implement those controls and what worked and what didn't. That's easier said than done, because it's quite difficult to get people with strong DevOps, cloud engineering, application development, and security backgrounds.
Yeah, and I think it's very similar to early DevOps kind of bootstrapping. It's finding people who are like a little bit versed in both worlds and kind of like understand the pain points, and maybe they're like more versed in one area and the other, but kind of creating this overlapping team, kind of this. Sometimes I call it like the empathy of or at least the understanding of the problem space at both sides of the fence. And now with like security, a third fence was there to be kicked. And I guess the multidisciplinary team and the collaboration already started within your team to get the knowledge in there, so you can probably like connect to others outside your company. So you already like, in 3 sentences, you explain like a massive thing, right? But kind of you got your team going, you hired them. You already mentioned you were reaching out to other people in the company. So tell us a little bit more on like how that went. Like, did you get like initial kind of interest? Did they see you as the kind of annoyance along the way, or how did it go?
I think it's a similar pattern that was seen previously as well. You tend to kind of find about 25% of people in the engineering teams in the company are early adopters, very enthusiastic about DevOps and transformation and DevSecOps. And so instantly your allies effectively. Then tend to have a kind of the central mass, about 50%, who will go with you once you've kind of made it easier for them. So once you've kind of put the groundwork in place, made these processes easy, you've got 75%. You still have a small minority, probably 10 to maybe up to about 25%, who this is the way we've always done it. Why are you changing it? Unfortunately, there's no easy answer to that. Some you can convert. I find sometimes just by explaining rather than kind of enforcing and mandating things. If you explain your reasoning behind it, you'll carry more along. Still will have, unfortunately, just a small minority who are averse to change, and there's not easy answer for that one, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I guess kind of what do you think made the other people, the adopters or the other adopters, what got them excited about your group? Because imagine you're selling your services as the DevSecOps team, right? Like, why would they even kind of care and listen to you? That you bring the value, that's something they need.
Yeah, so that tends to be the people who are early adopters on your site were because they'd seen it, they'd been there, done it, seen the benefits elsewhere. So they already knew what the outcome was. the middle ground was once we'd been able to implement these practices and basically, continuous delivery, technical principles, and some of the cultural ones. So cross-functional teams, making sure everything's managed under version control, configuration management, infrastructure as code, test automation, deploying by automated CI pipeline, so you have an expected state. Once you put all those things in place in a streamlined fashion, and then we're able to demonstrate how fast we could move and how much more reliable those services were and secure, because we were able to effectively codify our security standards in the config. And by only using automation to deploy and manage those resources, we had an expected state. So identifying anomalies, potential security risks became much easier. Once we'd actually put that in place for a few projects and did kind of company-wide demos and were publicizing that, that's kind of what triggered the realization and buy-in across the board, really.
Great. Do you recall some initial major wins that you remember, that is a turning point where everybody got on board or something like that?
Yeah, I think a big one was when we came in, there was originally for this platform 2 AWS accounts, non-prod and prod, with local IAM users in there. So this is for an AWS environment, and we came in and put a best practice multi-account strategy, so separate down to dev, test, prod, separate CI/CD account, initially a separate users account, and separate ops account, separate security account, and then we're using cross-account roles as the means of managing access between those accounts, and then obviously once we were able to integrate it into our IDP. We were just using federated access with IAM roles across all these accounts for access. We actually consolidated the user identities from Kubernetes as well to be using the IAM roles too. So effectively, by consolidating and simplifying that access mechanism, it was a step change from what was there before, and it made everyone's lives easier. So yeah, that was a big win, which we were able to clearly demonstrate.
Yeah, and it sounds like you were doing the work that everybody wanted already that would have been done, but nobody got around to. And then they found an ally in you, having a group that is working on dealing with the problem and solving the problem, I guess, for a lot of the people over there. So it also sounds like you have almost like a model that you went out for providing services. And I think a lot of the times DevOps teams, they got hang up in, we'll automate something in the pipeline and we'll make sure. But it sounds like you went outside of the team and kind of listened to the teams and offered services, which is kind of a different, it's more like user friendly to them than it is kind of just saying we need to automate this. So.
Yeah, so that's something we actually changed. So we did have some centralized AppSec capabilities when I came in, but that was very much managed by a centralized AppSec team, and it wasn't really taking into account the needs of the developers and what would be making their lives easier. It also didn't fit into kind of modern CI pipelines where you want instant response and feedback direct in the actual CI jobs itself. So we ended up refactoring what those services were, and making them effectively dev focused, dev first, and making the processes for those things to be able to be consumed really easy. So that's one of the things we did in terms of provided automated testing to the teams. But that was just one aspect. The first thing we did was a high level, which is let's define an engagement model for our security engineering team to work with the 300 odd teams that we need to. So that was where we started, because in effect we're only a smallish team. There's about 8 of us, and there's no way we can embed directly and do the engineering work in all of these teams. So effectively, we needed to become trainers, and we nominate a security champion, so a developer in each of the teams who's going to be responsible wants to take on the mantle of being responsible for security in that team, with the goal that if we train them, they can then spread that knowledge throughout their own teams. So yeah, we created that model to facilitate that.
Yeah, and I think that's the only way you can scale with 300 teams, right?
Yeah.
That is kind of essential, and it's also the difference between an ad hoc project and creating a service that's reusable and scalable. So can you give us maybe like a high-level run through how you would onboard a team? Like maybe a new team that comes in and that isn't familiar with the whole stack or like your way of working. How do you get them on board?
Yeah, so the first stage of our engagement model is understanding the team, understanding what it is, what they're building, what technology, what the tech stack is, what the capabilities of that team is, and then with that information, we're identifying what the security requirements need to be, and we do that via threat modeling. So part of the onboarding process for that is we request some information to allow us to do that. So that would be things like the information, contact details for the key stakeholders. So product owner, scrum master, lead developer, lead architect. We then ask for any architecture diagrams, any data flow diagrams that may exist, links to the code repositories, links to the Jira project. And originally we were kind of doing that, and we just had a Confluence page which said, please provide this information. And we didn't specify a method for teams to send that. So we were getting it via Teams, via Slack, via email. Sometimes we were getting half of the information we needed. So what we changed that to is we're using a Microsoft form, which just has a set of mandatory fields, and the teams click that, and that goes into just an Excel spreadsheet in SharePoint. And yeah, we're able to use that to kick off our threat modeling engagements. From there, we'll work with the teams to create a threat model which will identify the security threats and requirements specific to their project. To support that effort as well, we also have a security maturity questionnaire which we ask the team to fill out when they onboard to us. We use this as a means of, obviously it's good to have metrics to track what's going on, and so we use this as a means of quantifying a team's security maturity at the start of our engagement, and then we can see that improve as we progress through the different stages and activities.
Yeah, and I think that scaling, so far I heard about the almost like your discovery phase, right? You ask them for all the information, you kind of architecture, you got all the people in the room, but after a while, you can't cope with 300 teams doing this, right? And you mentioned, the request has been automated. That actually reminded me of the Microsoft OneNote. Once they kind of created like a feedback button in their app, they needed a system to scale the feedback, managing this feedback. So how do you dealt with that as the team? Because it probably keeps coming in as well.
So we have obviously with this number of teams, we have to have some means of prioritization. So the business will tell us tell us the prioritization from a business criticality perspective. So we'll have a pyramid of tiers of different projects. We'll start with the highest priority projects, and we'll be doing our threat modeling and our entire engagement process with those. As I mentioned, there's only a limited amount of security engineering resource to go around. So our full threat modeling engagement is limited. But to support our security activities, we have a number of security testing capabilities which we've operationalized into services. So things like static analysis, dependency scanning, DAST, RASP, and each of those have a service owner. You don't necessarily need to have gone through our full engagement process to consume one of those services. A team, if they know that they need static analysis in their pipeline, they can raise a request, because each of these services has their own onboarding form as well with a service owner, They can fill out that request form. We have all the onboarding material documented in Confluence. So it's aiming to be as self-service as possible. Given that we have some service owners for these functions as well, they can act as the technical point of contact. So if any team has any difficulties onboarding to this, they have someone to reach out to. We found that that's worked really well. I mean, we've been rolling this out to nearly these services out up to well over 100 teams now.
Yeah, but I hear a lot of the automation so far that you mentioned is almost like the discovery phase, or kind of helping them to discover or like open issues or like severity issues and so on. But eventually they have to be triaged and they have to be solved, right? So how did you go about maybe like educating them or like training them? Because threat modeling is supposed to be a continuous thing. It's not like only done once in kind of at the start of the project or something.
Yeah, absolutely. So as part of our engagement model is, if there's any new functionality or any refactor or anything like major change in any of the projects, we kick off the threat modeling again to make sure that any risks related to that new functionality are added in, and any necessary compensating controls are identified and then eventually created as JIRA tickets for the team to work on. The way that we've done that is by having our own set of risk libraries which correlate to our security standards. So the countermeasures will have enough context and implementation information that a team should always know what it is they need to do and have an idea of how to do it. Because we have a mindset of continuous improvement for all of our services. So if we get feedback that it's not clear, that's what we'll go and update at source to solve that problem happening in the future. In terms of our actual security testing tools, we try not to use them not to actually identify what security issues. We try to use those as validation that the security processes the team has got in place are as effective. For example, we don't see adding container vulnerability scanning or dependency scanning as a tick box exercise. Okay, cool, that's in. The thing we care about is the actual security process, which means that we're not having risks there in the first place. So they have a regular process to update and rebuild their containers with the latest security updates and redeploy them on a regular basis. Same for any third-party libraries which are being pulled in. Ideally, ideally these security testing jobs are just used as validation there.
Mm-hmm. So how did you deal? Because quite often you mentioned the backlog and the Scrum team and everybody involved. Quite often there's a discussion about like priorities and resources to be spent on like fixing issues. Were you involved in those discussions as well? Kind of like balancing efforts for the developers, what to work on, like what to dismiss, kind of that.
Yeah. So in terms of the prioritization of the security stories, they actually automatically come through once they're populated from our threat model, because their priority will be associated with the threat which they relate to. Mm-hmm. So a team will already have those security issues prioritized in their backlog, and it should work the same as any other story that we brought into a sprint by the product owner and the Scrum Master. They're able to go from the top. We will, by having the security champion and our security engineering team available for these sprint planning sessions, that's where we'd be help to scope the stories if anything needs additional information. But yeah, it should just follow the normal process. Again, that's why it's important to have kind of that buy-in for the value of security stories. In some cases, it could work for teams to have a focused sprint and treat it in much the same way as they might have a focused tech deck sprint.
Yeah, and did you have any conflicts on, let's say, you as a security would say, well, please fix this, and then the business said, no, we don't have time, maybe next quarter?
Yeah, plenty of times. That's why I think by having these threat models, which kind of give us a holistic view of what security risks are present in that platform really helps us and helps the business make those decisions. Like I said, it generally comes down to the business criticality of the product.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, was your team also involved in, let's say, operational security, or was it mostly a guidance and a ramp up of teams internally? Because usually there's also another tension, not only on the backlog, but on the operational side versus the kind of like fixing or project side.
We have a separate security operations team with our own SOC, which is separate. But there's a lot of crossover and collaboration there. Kind of, for example, our team will be identifying what the protective monitoring requirements are. So helping the teams understand what events, what application events they may need to capture, what events from the infrastructure platform. We'll make sure that the team is collecting those things and then sending them, aggregating them to the right place where the SOC are able to then analyze those things. And we also work with the teams to generate the right alert thresholds. And we also leverage some security tools to help us with that as well, because obviously that can be quite challenging when you've got the amount of CloudTrail logs and things that we do have.
Yeah. So one more question on the phase where we are. You're kind of like engaging the teams, you're ramping them up. Maybe after that question, Dan, you can kind of jump in if there's any questions from there. So what are some, you mentioned kind of you have this catalog and your questionnaire about the maturity levels that, you kind of assess the different groups when you onboard them, and probably while they're progressing, you see their maturity in different layers go. Like, what are some examples or some kind of, if you go in a company right now, is like, I'm going to ask you 4 questions. And with that, I'm pretty sure I can assess your kind of maturity. What would you ask?
What we have for our security maturity questionnaire really is trying to understand, well, first of all, what a team's attitude is to security. Do they see it as a shared responsibility? Much in the same way that QA testing was brought into the DevOps fold, and you have developers writing testing. Is there a mindset that developers are responsible for their security? So that's something that's actually the first thing the second thing we ask in a questionnaire. The first is, how do you engage with security? Is it something that you're proactively doing yourself and looking for security input to identify any requirements with new functionality, or is it something you're expecting you're leaving to come out in a pen test and then fix when it's too late? So that's one of the first things. When are you looking to identify what your security risks are in your products? And how early do you do it? That's the key one. And the other major one which I mentioned was, what's your attitude to it? Do you feel like it's your team's responsibility, or is that your external security team's problem to worry about down the line? I think that they're the 2 major ones.
Yeah, it's interesting that you didn't mention any kind of technicalities. You just focused the 2 or the 3 points. You focused on mentality and mindset on how to deal with that. So, the technical things of introducing security testing. Often you get a false sense of confidence because it can be treated like a box ticking exercise. Yes, you've got all these security testing job stages in. Are you doing anything with them? Is your team actually actioning those results? Yeah, it's interesting. There was a talk by John Alspaugh who talked about if you would leave your CI pipeline alone for a while, like how long would that be? Like, imagine you leave it alone for a day. Would it still be running? If you leave it alone for a week, would it still be running? And it basically, some people start cringing after an hour, a day, a week. And it's basically because it starts showing that there's human involvement. Like you can't just leave it like that. And the human mindset of dealing with the issues is an important thing. So let's take this opportunity for Dan to jump in right now. So.
Great, thanks, Patrick. Yeah, I mean, very interesting discussion. I think We've had a few questions from the audience so far. So if you do have questions that you want to ask Nick, or feel free to ask Patrick, or even ask myself, and I'll just divert them to the other two, of course. But we've had a few questions, but I'm going to just actually lead with one of my own first, Nick, actually, and that's just around the skills. It's kind of an interesting week for skills. We had the ISC Squared report come out yesterday talking about a reduction in the global shortage of people. What kind of skills would you look for someone who's you're looking to bring in to run the security side and make DevOps become DevSecOps? What sort of skills should a person have to work in that kind of setup?
I think, to be honest, it's something you want to balance out across your team. You need some. If you're going to be doing DevSecOps, you need people with DevOps knowledge and experience, and you also need people with security knowledge and experience. You need someone who's been working in some form in a DevOps fashion for a reasonable amount of time to understand what both those cultural and technical principles are and how they're effectively implemented. From the security side of things, you need to have a good knowledge of offensive security and what attack scenarios are across range of different tech stacks, because that's what's going to help with your threat modeling. So you'll be better at identifying the security risks. So you need that mix, really. One, to be able to generate those attack scenarios and identify those security risks, and the other side of it, which is having the knowledge of building and managing those services to understand what the right implementation looks like and what the limitations of your recommendations are. A lot of the time, that can be what's frustrating with security. Is security team could just be chucking a CIS benchmark at a team without understanding that maybe some of these things just can't be implemented in that fashion because of limitations in that technology or product. So you need a balance of that. I mean, you can get lucky, and you could have had someone who's been working as a sysadmin doing DevOps and then going around doing some security consultancy for a while. But most of the time, you'll need to bring in different people. So we found that we've got a good balance of getting people who are very strong on security. So people who'd be focusing on pen testers, doing lots of bug bounties, really doing code reviews, reverse engineering, and then skilling them up more on the kind of software development side of things. So on DevOps and agile project management. The same side, we'd have some very experienced DevOps people, some application architects, and then skilling them up in terms of security. And ideally you want to promote cross collaboration there, because then the team can learn from each other and you upskill everyone. That we found that to be really effective. I just noticed there's a couple of good questions in here, actually.
Yeah, I was going to refer to those. Please go to it, straight to it. Yeah, thanks.
So in terms of how has remote working impacted DevSecOps strategies? So to be honest, this was already happening before COVID and remote working, but I think the biggest impact there was how we're doing threat modeling. I think threat modeling via a whiteboard session in a room is a really good activity, because you can bring in the developers, any other key stakeholders who understand how that product system works, and then you can collaboratively identify those attack scenarios, and that helps the team really get an empathy for what the security considerations are. So we found that was actually, never mind actually generating the threat model from that, just improving security empathy within the teams. That was a really beneficial thing. But obviously, you can't do that if you can't be in the same room. Tried to do that remotely, it just doesn't work. So we ended up having to do a completely different thing in terms of threat modeling, which was using a framework called Iris Risk, but that's another talk in itself. Cool. So next question. What have we got?
Nick, if you want to go to those two, and we'll come back to that one that came in second a bit later, because I quite like that as more of a general thing. But the two would come in the last, one came in at just 27 minutes past. How can I encourage better cohesion between the dev team and the security team? This has always been a little bit of a rumor that security and devs sort of sit like kind of, the Capulets and Montagues and don't really kind of meet in the middle. So yeah, how can a company make that sort of divide come together almost?
Cool. So I think that's part of improving empathy across the team. But a key thing as well, I think you need to have your security team understanding software development, understanding DevOps. Like I say, that comes down to the problem of just chucking blanket security requirements at a team and then just chasing them up to do it. I think the more knowledge, we've certainly found this, that the more knowledgeable our security team are in terms of, actually being DevOps engineers and being able to make those changes themselves, the more that's appreciated throughout the team. So, for example, our team, will quite happily go and raise those merge requests themselves and help, push that through the test environments and have it ready to ship, just as like a contributing member of that development team would be. I think that certainly helps the relationship between security and the dev teams. I mean, ideally, if you really are doing DevOps well, they're not separate teams, and they'll be your security engineer or security champion will be a fully contributing member of that development team. So you won't feel like you have that separation.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept. And I did the other question we had.
Sorry, I'll just add a bit more to that actually.
No, please, yeah.
So another good thing as well is you want the security team to be flexible in terms of taking any feedback or input about any security processes you're essentially almost enforcing them on them. So things like, if you're using, a good example is, right, if you're using a static analysis tool, which is taking an hour to run and slowing up the pipeline, that's not something you want to be doing. You want to be making sure that the security tools and the security functions you're creating and providing to these teams are fit for purpose and fit with a good modern SDLC.
Great. And we'll just go to that last question. We'll come back to the other one I mentioned a bit later on, which is about security champions, in case anyone's wondering. But this one we had in about 7 minutes ago. How would you suggest implementing DevSecOps into a small team of 4 developers, 1 QA? I am the Dev security champion. We'll come back to that, as I said, but not entirely sure where I should be focusing my efforts. So what's a good start for, I say, a small team of 4 developers, Nick? Where's a good point to sort of say this is how we're going to do it?
Cool. So the place I'd start would be identifying what your security requirements are for those teams, for those projects. So start with threat modeling. There's numerous resources you can go and find about that. What I used to favor when doing it from a manual approach was attack trees and using either CIA or Stride for the categorization. But again, Adam Shostak wrote a book called Threat Modeling, which is pretty much the most authoritative resource to start with on that. So I start from there. And again, threat modeling is something that you'll only get better the more you do it. So I think it does. If you're not doing it at all, whatever you're doing will be an improvement. So start with threat modeling and then iterate through that. Through your threat modeling, you'll identify what else you need from a security perspective. So you'll identify what security testing tools you need. For example, if you're a team which is building a Java project and it's inside a container, you'll know you need static analysis, dependency scanning, container vulnerability scanning, and then depending on which environment you're deploying into, it might determine other things as well. But that threat modeling would be the place to start there.
I'll just go maybe just one more question, maybe Pat, just before I step back to you. But the threat modeling thing, I think, in the conversations we've had running up to this webinar is something that I think people have heard about. But do you, in your experience, people actually know what that is and what it involves?
I mean, to be honest, it's something which seems to have got a lot more understood over the last few years. I think if you go back 4 years ago or something, if you were asking for threat modeling experience when recruiting security engineers or DevSecOps engineers, you wouldn't get many people be able to give you a good answer. But I think now, due to how effective it's been in the places that are doing it, I think it's certainly a lot better understood, and there's certainly lots of places doing it very well.
Yeah, no, I'm familiar with Adam, not so much with his work, more familiar with him, but it's something I've come across, and I think, just something like when you said that a couple of times today about threat modeling, it's one I think maybe. Do you think that's a good starting point?
Definitely. I mean, it alleviates a number of problems. One of them, which is just chucking a blanket set of requirements on a team, which may not even be relevant. That was always traditionally a key point of frustration with dev teams, which is they're being chucked the whole secure coding practices like standard at them, and half of it wouldn't be relevant to anything they're doing. So by only identifying specific security requirements, and then actually helping, we go a step further than that, which our security team will help validate what's already in place. So then we only create the kind of delta, so of what's needed to get to the desired state as a body of work for the teams. So by minimizing the work you're asking the teams to do, that also removes a lot of tension with the team itself and from the product owner, who's suddenly scared about his deadlines for delivering what they consider their core functionality.
Yeah, Patrick, I don't know if you wanted to take back a.
Yeah, I could add to that, and it's something I learned over the years while I was doing TDD with the team. Initially, in the early days, I had like this understanding. It was like about writing tests and making it more robust and more resilient, and only later somebody pointed out to me that TDD is actually about changing your architecture and the conversation. And I've seen that in Agile with TDD. I've seen that in DevOps with the infrastructure as code. If you think DevOps as the configuration management and the delivery pipeline, and I'm seeing it now with the DevSecOps, where threat modeling is not just like making the exercise of what is vulnerable and what's not vulnerable and what can we do about it. It's having that conversation, and that services so much of the knowledge, the understanding, and it also makes it more neutral in a way that we're talking about the problem. We're not talking about egos, like I think, you think. This is kind of like pointing to the board instead of pointing to each other, and that really helps in kind of leveling up skills. So for me, it's no surprise that this is the emerging kind of conversational style in DevSecOps that is picking up, because that's where the value is, and that's where the human and the technology kind of, which is ingrained in DevOps, kind of shines now in DevSecOps as well. So
it really helps at all aspects. For example, so for threat modeling, you're able to quantify what your actual security risk is, which is much easier reporting to executives of business decisions, because before you'd be going, okay, have we got a pen test? Is that a year out of date? Or just some ad hoc people finding vulnerabilities as they're looking through the code repositories. The threat modeling gives you a holistic view of everything, all security risks associated with that product. It also helps with, so you mentioned TDD. By threat modeling, if you've already got a good testing framework in place, threat modeling will help you identify what the technical risks are, and you can create test cases in your pipelines to validate those countermeasures are effectively in place. It also helps you in terms of protective monitoring, because you've got something to guide you in terms of identifying what your alert cases are, and then you can, which aids you can provide that to the SOC, which makes their lives a lot easier, because then they're not forced to, with no context, decide what security events are relevant and why.
Yeah, I think it was Jay Bloom, works at Red Hat, but he mentioned that there's one of the practices in DevOps is the value stream mapping, like where is the value getting created? And then he called it like, okay, this is the value chain. And somebody reported to him and says like, there's the value chain and there's the kill chain, right? So you both have to understand where it's created, but where it could be killed, and that's the risk you mentioning that is like made visible in all the conversations. So taking it from here, you kind of get together now. You discuss the model, the threat modeling. We talked about leveling up the skills of the team. We need to have a way of all these initiatives, like even if we have management buy-in, to show value, right? And to keep showing value of that this is a useful exercise. So how did you go about that in the company?
So we actually, again, to us, security metrics are always a challenge. Traditionally, if you're talking about just reporting on vulnerability stats, you could have a high-performing team often looking similar to a low-performing team in terms of detections, because the high-performing team was identifying and addressing them before they got to production, or has automatic processes in place to deploy security updates. So their detection rate would be low in production because there's not that much there. Whereas a low-performing team would not necessarily have the scan coverage in place, or it could be misconfigured. So yeah, you obviously often you've got a false representation from vulnerability metrics. That's something we try to address that with two things. One of them is by the threat modeling, to have a consistent approach of identifying security risk across the products, and by the security maturity questionnaire, because that helps give context to the other results we're getting from teams. For example, if we're getting a very low number of OS package or dependency vulnerability stats from a few teams, we notice they're very low down the security maturity score. That tells us that there might not be something right there, and we need to pay further attention to it. Likewise, if we're getting high results, high maturity scores from a team, and we're seeing those metrics, that kind of suggest that yes, that is an accurate representation. So we've tended to split the reporting up into two things. One of them has been by going off the identified threats through the threat modeling and their associated risk, and the status of implementing the countermeasures to address those threats. So that's what we're doing from the kind of reporting on the design and security aspect. We also then are reporting on what we refer to as the operational security, which would be those more traditional vuln stats as well. But by combining those and the security maturity questionnaire, it gives us a much more, what we think is a much more accurate representation of what the true security risk is across those projects.
Cool. Yeah, we hit a little bit of a snafu in the beginning. Maybe now it's the time, like you had a few slides, we already talked about a lot of the stuff, but it's good to maybe summarize it, like with the diagrams that we had prepared. And then in the end, maybe my final question is like, you've been now, like 2-3 years in, like what would you have advised your, like, going back in time, if you will only have known from there? So maybe Dan, if you can put up the slides, and then he can go from there. So listen to yourself.
Okay.
Cool. So as I was saying, here's our engagement model, and it's broadly into 3 stages. So we can see in the first one, that's where we're understanding that team, getting to know them, finding as much information as we can. So there's architecture diagrams, and then doing some activities like running through our data classification, figuring out if they've got any PII or any credit card data or anything like that. And then we're via those forms, we're asking those teams to fill out that security maturity assessment. And then the main body of work in the first stage is generating that threat model, and then creating that body of work via Jira stories to implement those countermeasures. The second stage is when we're helping the teams implement those security measures. Sometimes that can be through liaising with the team, or more commonly now, because with the Security Champions program, doing that via the Security Champions and helping guide them. We also, part of the second stage will be integrating any relevant security testing functions which we've identified as necessary as part of the threat modeling. We'll also be involved in kind of DevSecOps coaching. So, if a team's, most of that time, that is just kind of improving some of the DevOps practices and their implementation state, and also providing security training. We've had a few means of doing this. We're using a kind of interactive security training tool called Secure Code Warrior for security training. where teams will do a number of interactive assessments based on whichever language they're using. And that helps give us a baseline of their capability. So we can focus any particular areas of training. And also it helps upskill them by going through the activities in itself. The third stage, here's kind of when we're making sure that we've got continuous monitoring and protective monitoring in place, making sure that we're capturing all the necessary potential security events, that they're going to the SOC, and that there's an incident response process in place for those different alerts when they go off. We also still carry out pen test activities, just to act as independent third-party validation of the security work we're doing, and we use both public and private bug bounties as well. So we have some form of continuous third-party testing on a number of our products. And yeah, as the diagram shows, this is a continuous process where as new features are added, we'll kick off and update that threat model and identify any new security requirements and countermeasures that come in.
I like how it goes counterclockwise, like the UK, always in the different directions. maybe we can get to the next slide, Dan.
Yeah, sure.
As I mentioned, here's what our security questionnaire looks like. We have a scale of 1 to 4 in terms of maturity, and we have 13 questions across 3 sections. And we designed this to really to fit with our engagement model. So it's tailored to us, with the goal of being as concise and simple as possible. I've used other maturity kind of frameworks in the past, notably OpenSAM, which previously had found was a bit overwhelming for teams. I know iOS has done a lot of work with OSSAM recently, so that's worth investigating if you haven't got your own tailored security maturity framework. But as I was mentioning, the main use we found for this was a means of quantifying the maturity across our different teams and being able and giving context to other security metrics we're getting in.
Okay, your next slide.
Yeah.
Sure.
And as I was saying as well, we have a number of security functions which we provide as a service. And yeah, it's diagrams from our Confluence page, which just kind of illustrates at what stage of the SDLC they're normally carried out in. Each service has their own functional owner who's responsible for choosing the right tool. Again, that doesn't stand still. We're empowering the people with subject matter expertise in those areas to be owners for these functions. So if they deem that there's a new better tool, they'll go and carry out evaluation, make a case for that, and we can bring that in. These service owners are responsible for defining those processes and creating the training material for the teams. Yeah, that's that one.
Great.
There's just one more question that I'll just go on to quickly, which is, should more organizations implement security champion schemes? I think absolutely, unless you're resourced in a way that you can have a dedicated security engineering team on your teams. The next best thing is having a security champions program where you nominate a developer to be responsible for that. The baseline requirement for that is they've got to be a contributing member of that team. So you can't just bring in anyone and say you're the security champion. They've got to be a developer who's able to make changes and deploy that through the pipeline. And ideally, someone who's got an interest and an enthusiasm for security and is keen to learn.
Yeah, a better familiarity would be good. And I think first to that question we had with someone said small team of 4 developers. I presume that's a relatively small IT DevOps security setup. So familiarity is probably quite likely, but in a huge company where there's probably several floors, it's probably quite hard, isn't it? Really, because you are gonna have people who just don't know each other. So
everything's harder in a huge company.
Well, of course, yeah. But I think you got that personal element, and I I'm thinking of one company, I won't name them, but one of the big food delivery companies, should we say, and I went to their office many years ago, and I remember just seeing like huge numbers of developers, and there was a security team in the corner, and it was like, oh, okay. So, right, I think we are kind of running up towards the very end. So just before, maybe just one more question for you, Nick, and for Patrick. Just do you see the kind of future of DevSecOps? It's mid-November as we record today. As we move into sort of this particularly difficult year and move out of this very difficult year into hopefully a much better 2021, do you see this is a way that people are working more efficiently now? Do you think this is something people are adopting a lot more? Maybe Nick, for you first on that.
I think so. I think certainly people are trying to. So yeah, I think they certainly are. I think to be honest, it's the same challenges as DevOps transformations. Really, it's seeing and hearing a lot. I used to do a consultancy role, so I got to go into a lot more places. But hearing what's going on as well, it's often companies can get stuck in anti-patterns when they're trying to do both DevOps and Agile. And to be honest, the more you get DevOps right, the easier security is. Because like I said, if you're applying things like, if you're doing things like infrastructure as code, using configuration management, have automated test frameworks and test jobs in your pipelines, and you're deploying via automated CI pipeline, it becomes very much easier to codify your standards and also validate, because you have an expected state to test against. To be honest, the majority of security vulnerabilities is if you're just updating your software, deploying that, you'll be ahead of the game. That's probably the biggest number of issues is just from outdated software.
Yeah, and maybe Pat, just sort of a same question to you, really.
Yeah, I think historically in 2010 people were already talking about putting security into DevOps, but I think it's come to a point where the industry matured, the pipeline got more robust, the practices around DevOps and collaboration got more robust. So while the initial bottleneck was between dev and ops collaborating and that tension, the bottleneck has now moved. So if you think about in system thinking in a company, it makes sense that like over the years, this is where things are going. Obviously, the whole security thing with working in the cloud using services has added to the same thing like containers did with DevOps and the cloud did with DevOps, that it's just like amplifying that need. And I don't think it will go away. We're still a long way of kind of making it so easy. And that's why it's important to get these stories out, because I think the value of DevOps has been the label to get the stories out. The value of DevSecOps is, again, the label where we can get stories like this out onto the world and people kind of learn from each other and build upon the practices. Like, this worked for us, this is going to be the mainstream practice, and this is kind of how it evolves. Maybe in the future we'll hit other bottlenecks and we'll go into other stuff like HR and business and marketing and AI ops, and there's always going to be a bottleneck, but security is here to stay. It's going to be a competitive advantage in the next couple of years. When one major vulnerability hit like 100 companies, who's going to survive the market? And I hate to be kind of the doomsayer, and that's not what I want to do, but it's kind of preparing for that state, like resilience has been taking over in the DevOps narrative. It's kind of being prepared, and part of that being prepared is making sure you kind of like are secure enough. You don't have to over-secure yourself, but you kind of have to be secure enough, or at least have a strategy to recover and get through, when things are happening. So that's kind of my perspective then.
Yeah. I think those who do right shift left. I've just thought of that. That's quite good, isn't it? And right, we are slightly over, so we are going to have to wrap things up there. So huge thanks to all of you for joining us today and for all of your questions. And obviously huge thanks to Snyk for their sponsorship, and to Patrick and to Nick, our speakers today. Our next webinar is actually just under 2 hours. Actually, it takes place at 6 p.m. UK. That's 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific, on No Perimeter, No Problem, Crypto Strategy Security for a Zero Trust Future. That's with Michael. So that'll be taking place at 6 o'clock, so just an hour and 55 minutes from as we finish right now. There will be a recording of this webinar available very shortly, so you'll be able to listen to this all over again. And if you have any sort of need to contact any of the speakers here, then obviously either just tweet me at Dan Raywood or at InfoSecurity Magazine, or just reach to us and we'll obviously get you connected to them if you need so. Obviously just contact Snyk. I'm sure you can find your representative fairly easily online. As I said, if you have any on your way out, please do rate the webinar. Let us know what you liked. Always good to get your feedback. And obviously, please do contact us with any sort of ideas, things you'd like to be covering in the future. We're kind of moving towards the end of the year now, but as we move into 2021, it's good to get your feedback on things you'd like us to be covering. So with that, again, huge thanks to Snyk, to Patrick, to Nick, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody.